Today we got some more actual history about the Creek War of 1813 and 1814. Today's episode took place in November of 1813, when the settlers of the Alabama River region were starting to turn the tide of the war, after the Creeks had massacred over 500 soldiers, women, and children at Fort Mims on August 30th, 1813. This episode will cover the famous canoe fight, where 3 settlers in their small canoe fought 9 Indians in their larger canoe in hand-to-hand combat on the Alabama River. We will be reading from this book, The Creek War of 1813 and 1814, by Henry S. Halbert and Timothy H. Ball. This book was published all the way back in 1895. So in this episode, we will first hear about some minor skirmishes and attacks that took place in October and early November between settlers venturing out from Fort Madison to try to salvage some of their crops, and Creek warriors lying in wait to attack them. We will then hear about the canoe fights, where 3 white settlers, along with a black man named Caesar who was steering their canoe, fought 9 Creek warriors in the middle of the Alabama River. A steed comes at morning, no rider is there, but its bridle is red with the sign of despair. Lochiel's warning. The Bashi Skirmish. It is not certain when the events bearing this name took place. An intelligent citizen of Clark County says that it was before Fort Easley was evacuated. Pickett says it was early in October. The inmates of Fort Easley and of Turner's Fort came for greater security to Fort St. Stephen's, probably early in September. And from this neighborhood, Colonel William McGrew with some 25 mounted men had gone up the river into the Woods Bluff neighborhood to look after the Indians who, among the various tenantless and exposed plantations, were committing depredations. Before this small band of horsemen had reached a little stream called Bashi that flows into the Tombigbee River a mile or 2 north of Woods Bluff, they suddenly found themselves among concealed Creek warriors. They were ambushed. A turkey tail was raised above a log by one of the concealed Indians, and this was the signal for the attack. The Indians who had guns instantly fired from their places of concealment, and the white leader, William McGrew, who had taken part in the burnt corn engagement, fell from his horse. Edmund Miles was also killed, and Jesse Griffin severely wounded. Colonel McGrew's men returned the fire of the Indians, but without much effect. The Indians from their places of ambush had largely the advantage of the mounted men, and these found it needful to make good their retreat. Besides the commanding officer, 3 of the men were missing: Edmund Miles, Jesse Griffin, and David Griffin. These 2 Griffins were twins. One of them on the morning of that fatal day seemed to expect some calamity, and they agreed to stand by each other, the one not to leave the other in case of danger. They came into the world together, and they proposed, if need should be, to stand or fall side by side, and go out of the world together as well. According to the best information, Jesse Griffin was shot through the thigh, and being unable to retreat with the others, his brother David, according to their agreement, stayed by him while life remained. It is one tradition that the 2 kept up a fire upon the Indians as fast as they could load their guns until 7 of the Indians were killed. But however that may be, it is very sure that among the few whites and the Indians slain, the body of David Griffin was not found. His son William Griffin, born at Woods Bluff in 1812, and at this time with his mother either in Fort Easley or at St. Stephen's, a resident at Bashi in 1879, states, as the account was given to him, that the last sight which his comrades had of his father, as the Indians were still firing upon them in their retreat, showed him in the act of loading his gun, himself then with a broken limb, but resolute in appearance, as determined to fight to the last moment of his life. William Griffin was informed by those who had a right to know that the body of his father was surely never found. All that was found as a trace of him on that skirmish field was the breech of his gun. The barrel was not there. His body, like the body or person of the young Kimball boy, disappeared. How, none of his friends ever knew. Colonel McGrew's horse, like the dark charger of Mamilius in Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, started for his home. Says Alexander Carleton, Esquire of Clark County, on the next morning after the battle the colonel's horse was at St. Stephen's, 30 miles distant with signs of blood on the saddle, and only 1 pistol in his holster. Some days afterwards, General Claiborne crossed the river from St. Stephen's and advanced into this Woods Bluff and Bashi region. The bodies of Colonel McGrew, of Edmund Miles, and of Jesse Griffin were found and were buried with military honors. These men fell about 5 miles east of Woods Bluff, near the present Linden and Coffeyville Road, and about half a mile southwest of the Bashi Bridge. General Claiborne spent a few days scouring this wild region. He found some Indians. Several of his men were wounded in the skirmish engagements. Among those severely wounded was Captain William Bradbury, another of those officers who had fought at Burnt Corn. Says Honorable E.S. Thornton of West Bend, he was shot about 2 miles above the Lewis Mitchell place and 5 miles above West Bend on the old Coffeyville and Woods Bluff River Road. His wound proved to be fatal. Claiborne and his men returned to Jackson below St. Stephen's, on the east side of the river, then commonly called Pine Level, and there for a time they camped, hoping to receive orders or permission from General Flournoy to cross the Alabama River and proceed into the Creek country. During September and October of 1813, many depredations were committed by small parties of Indians in the fort, and occasionally some of the settlers were killed. About the last of October, one of Carson's men, named Beard, was killed near Fort Madison. The circumstances of his death, as detailed to the writer several years ago by the Reverend Josiah Allen and his brother Henry, both of whom knew Beard well, were as follows. Early one morning, 2 wagons, one driven by Jim Dale, the other by Malachi Charbrough, with a detail of soldiers, were sent a mile or so above Fort Madison to get a supply of corn for the garrison. Not long after their departure, Beard, who was on the sick list and temporarily boarding with the family of Makaja Benji, borrowed the latter's horses and, equipped with saber and holster pistols, left the fort and started out to Benji's farm to get a supply of potatoes and collards. A short distance from the fort he met one of the soldiers of the detail, who had received permission to return to get more cartridges, as he found out that he had only a few in his cartridge box. Benji's collard and potato patch, comprising about 2 acres, was situated on the ridge, about half a mile north of the fort. At the southwest corner of the patch there had stood 3 large pines. As these trees shaded the patch too much, Benji cut them down. They had fallen down the western slope of the ridge, their trunks lying parallel and their tops interlocking. The road leading northward from the fort, the road which the soldiers and the wagon had taken, had once run along the western string of the fence, but on account of the fallen trees at this point, it had been turned somewhat to the left, passing along by the treetops and entering the original road near the northwest corner of the patch. 5 Creek warriors, bent upon some hostile deed, had secreted themselves in these treetops. As the wagons came along, they saw that there were too many soldiers to venture an attack, so they lay close. After a while, when the wagons had disappeared from sight, Beard came up. He rode along by the pine stumps, in the original road between the Indians and the fence. He dismounted near the northwest corner of the patch, tied his horse by the reins to the fence, then climbed over and began to cut some collards. He had retained his sword but left his pistols in the holsters. Meanwhile, the soldier whom Beard had met, having replenished his cartridge box, was hastening back on the road to overtake the wagons. The soldier had arrived within about 200 yards of the patch when he saw 2 Indians spring out of the treetops, run and leap over the fence, and with a loud war whoop rush towards Beard. Beard dropped his collards and ran to the eastern string of the fence, which he crossed with the warriors close at his heels. He then ran along the string of the fence to the southeast corner, and there took a hog trail which led out into the main road, near where the soldier stood, for the latter had halted on seeing the Indians. The soldier threw his musket to his shoulder, but feared to fire lest he might kill Beard, who was just in front of the Indians and on a line with them. At last Beard came to where the trail ran somewhat to the right, in the midst of some post oak runners. Here the Indians shot him down, crushed his skull with light wood knots, scalped him, took his sword, and then ran away at full speed towards the east. All this occurred in the space of a few minutes, and within 200 yards of the soldier, who afterwards said that the post oak runners were so thick at the spot where Beard was killed that he could not see the Indians, and that they were out of sight before he could get a good aim at them. Just after Beard was killed, the soldier said that he saw the 3 other Indians spring from their lair at the treetops and flee at great speed across the potato patch in the same direction taken by their comrades. Lieutenant Bradbury's company had just left the fort for an excursion when they heard the firing, and instantly wheeling, they came to the place at full gallop, David Glass being the first man to reach the spot where Beard lay. Soon afterwards, the wagons with the detail, coming back at full speed, arrived on the ground, for they too heard the firing. Bradbury's troopers, after hearing the statement of the soldier, made an excursion eastward in search of the Creek warriors, but failed to find them. Beard's body was placed on one of the wagons, brought back to the fort, and there buried. His horse, frightened by the Indian war whoop, had fortunately broken loose and returned to the fort. Beard was about 35 years old and was said to have come to the Mississippi Territory from Illinois or Missouri. During the occupation at Fort Madison, many excursions were made by the citizens and soldiers, sometimes perhaps merely in quest of adventure, and sometimes to gain information in regard to the movements of the enemy. The most noted of these excursions was made under the lead of Tandy Walker, once government blacksmith at St. Stephen's. This party, consisting of Tandy Walker, George Foster, an expert hunter, and a bold quadroon mulatto named Evans, left Fort Madison early in November, crossed the Alabama River, and advanced, says Pickett, to the battleground of Burnt Corn, but Meek, whose statement we prefer, says they advanced to the destroyed residence of James Cornell's at Burnt Corn Spring. We quote Judge Meek's narrative. When near the place, Evans dismounted, and leaving his horse with his companion, stealthily approached to make observations. In a field he saw an Indian at a short distance digging potatoes. He at once shot him, and after some minutes, not seeing any other Indians, he entered the field and took the scalp of his victim. Returning to his companions, they examined the premises and found on the opposite side of the field the camp and baggage of a considerable party of Indians who had fled at the sound of Evans's gun. With this booty, the 3 adventurers now hastened towards the Alabama River. At Sizemore's deserted old place near the river, they found a field of corn, nearly ripe with plenty of fine grass. Though they saw many moccasin tracks and other signs of Indians, they determined to stop here and feed their horses, and to pass the night. They accordingly went a short distance into the field, and as it was a cool November evening, kindled a small fire and lay down to sleep. In the night, Foster had a strange and alarming dream, or vision as he termed it, which awoke him and filled him with apprehension. Arousing his comrades and telling his dream, he urged them to leave the spot as he felt they were in danger there from the Indians. They made light of his fears and lapsed back into slumber. He, however, arose and going still further into the field, threw himself down in the high grass and then went to sleep. At the dawn of the day he was aroused by a volley of guns fired upon his companions, and fled with all haste into a neighboring canebrake, through which he made his way to the river, and swimming it he safely reached the fort. After 2 days, Tandy Walker came in, severely wounded, his arm being broken by several balls, and his side badly bruised by a ball which struck a butcher knife in his belt. It appeared that the Indians had waited until the first faint light of day to make their attack. They then fired some 5 or 6 guns, and rushed forward with their knives. Evans was killed, but Walker, though wounded, sprang from the ground and ran through the corn and high grass. Being very swift of foot, he outstripped his pursuers, and soon got into the canebrake where he lay concealed till night, suffering greatly from his wounds. Then he proceeded to the river, and making a raft of canes to which he hung by his well arm, he swam across. He was so feeble from the loss of blood and from pain that it took him all that night and the next day to reach Fort Madison. Pickett gives the 5th of November as the date of this affair on the Alabama River. As a slight supplement to the story, we will state on the authority of one of Walker's old friends that after he had taken refuge in the canebrake, the Creeks searched for him a long time. Several times they came very near his hiding place, but finally, to Walker's great relief, a note or signal sounded on a powder charger caused them to abandon the search. The North American Indian has, with good reason, when on what is called the warpath, been dreaded by the white inhabitants of the frontiers. For he was cunning, quick, sagacious, often merciless. He knew how to come unexpectedly upon exposed households, to strike fierce and murderous blows, and to make good his retreat, taking with him scalps and even helpless women and children. But in the earliest settlements of the Atlantic coast, it was proved that, with all his shrewdness and powers of endurance and forest bravery, he was not, after all, a match, even-handed, for the cultivated white man. The most noted hand-to-hand conflict between white men and Indians in New England history is the encounter between Captain Miles Standish with 3 of his Plymouth comrades against Pecksnot, Wettawammot, and 2 other Indian chiefs, all heads of a conspiracy formed to exterminate Weston's colony and then massacre the Pilgrims. Standish had gone among the Indians and waited for his opportunity. It soon came. The 4 Indian conspirators were all entrapped in one cabin. The door was secured. The 4 white men were also within, and as a witness, the friendly Indian Habermac. A terrific death grapple at once ensued. There were no shrieks, no cries, no war whoops. Nothing was heard save the fierce panting of the combatants, and the dull thud of the blows given and returned. Habermac stood quietly by and meddled not. Soon the Englishmen were successful. Each slew his opponent, Standish himself killing Pecksnot, an Indian of immense muscular size and strength, who had said not long before to the captain, "You are a great officer, but a little man. I possess great strength and courage." Here there were 4 against 4 shut in by cabin walls. The Alabama River canoe fight was a conflict where the whites apparently had greatly the disadvantage. There were not 4 against 4, but 3 against 9. The well-attested facts are these. The month is November. Small parties of the hostile Creeks were committing depredations among the Alabama River settlements. They were wanting food, were foraging when Captain Dale obtained permission from Colonel Carson, commanding at Fort Madison, to drive the Indians at least to the east side of the river. He had a force of 30 Mississippi volunteers under Lieutenant Montgomery and 40 militia of Clark County under Lieutenant G.W. Krieg. Captain Dale and his 2 lieutenants left Fort Madison on an expedition, which was to enroll at least 3 of their names among our noted Indian fighters. During the first day's march northward among the unoccupied plantations, they found no Indians. The second day they went in a southeasterly direction to the river, crossed it by means of 2 canoes at French's Landing, then called braziers, and camped on the bank. The night was cool, the men thinly clad. The next morning when the sun arose they resumed their march. Jeremiah Austell, our night courier, son of Captain Evan Austell, having charge of the 2 canoes, and with 6 men to aid him, commenced to pass up the river abreast of Dale and his company, who were marching along the eastern bank. Soon a canoe load of Indians was seen descending the river, but these Indians, on being discovered, paddled immediately back and passed from sight in the dense cane at the mouth of Randon's Creek. The men on the bank also met with Indians who retreated when the guns of Dale's men were fired upon them. 1 Indian was killed and several were wounded. It was soon found difficult to proceed further along the eastern bank, and orders were given to recross to the western side. When all had crossed over but 12 men, among them Dale, Smith, Austell, Krieg, Elliott, and Brady, and while those were preparing a late breakfast and roasting sweet potatoes in a little field, an alarm of Indians came from the western bank. Leaving their breakfast, they seized their guns and reached the river bank. They soon saw descending the river a large canoe containing a chief and 10 painted warriors. The Indians back of them on the eastern side, who had occasioned the alarm, for some reason made no attack on these 12 men, and they gave their whole attention to the large approaching canoe. Soon 2 cautious warriors sprang out and made for the shore. One of them Smith shot. The other made good his retreat eastward. The canoe man-of-war with 9 warriors continued to descend the river, and as only 1 small canoe with a black man named Caesar in charge was on the eastern shore, Dale ordered the larger canoe to be manned and brought over. 8 men started out to obey the order, but alarmed, as it appeared, by the threatening attitude of the 9 warriors in their large canoe, these 8 returned to the western shore. Captain Dale was vexed and proposed to his men to attack that canoe load with their own little dugouts. Besides Caesar, who paddled it, would carry but 3, and Dale stepped in, followed immediately by Smith and Austell, the latter taking his position in the prow. Those who have ever attempted to stand up or even to sit in one of these little river canoes can appreciate some of the disadvantage on the side of the whites. For 3 men in such a frail support to undertake a life or death grapple with some 9 stout Indian warriors in a much more stable boat, a canoe so called that could carry 11 or more men. The expectant Indians awaited the attack as their boat floated on, and Caesar, at Dale's command, with the vigorous strokes of his paddle, sent the small canoe directly towards the large one. The 3 Americans with their guns in their hands attempted first to pour on a broadside, but one gun only was discharged, and that with little effect, the priming having been dampened in the other 2. Caesar was now ordered to pull up alongside, and then the real conflict began. It was the 12th day of November, a day to be remembered in Alabama Indian border strife, when on the beautiful Alabama in that noted river bend, with 9 American spectators on one bank and 61 on the other, and how many concealed Indians in the dense canes none knew. Judge Meek says nearly 300. This conflict of 3 against 9 was waged. Neither Americans nor Indians could help their fellows. They could only await the issue of this unequal encounter. It was a perilous moment as the little canoe closed upon the other, with Austell, a young man of 19, in the prow, watching how or where the first blow might fall. He was not left in uncertainty for long, for as the prow of the American canoe touched the other, and before he could strike a blow or grapple with a red warrior, the rifle of the chief who, when the canoes were about 2 feet apart, had exclaimed in English words, "Now for it, Big Sam!" came like lightning heavily down upon his head. That the blow did not kill him is strange. Dale and Smith sprang instantly to his rescue, and with their heavy rifles and strong arms soon dispatched the chief. His words of challenge were his last. Caesar then brought the canoes side by side, and so held them during the remainder of the sharp but short fight. It was give blows and take in rapid succession, Austell having immediately regained his feet and his prowess and doing his part in the fearful fray. In the thick of this fierce onset, he was again struck down, now by an Indian war club, but was rescued again by Dale, and once more regaining his feet, he wrenched the war club from the Indian warrior, and with it dashed him into the river. Smith performed his full part in the conflict, and soon every Indian warrior was slain. 8 dead bodies were cast into the flowing waters of the Alabama when this tiger strife was over, and Austell with the war club had already sent 1 warrior adrift upon the river. It was difficult at the time, it is impossible and needless now, to detail the part performed by each of these 3 heroic men in that conflict. Like the old dauntless 3, Horatius, Lartius, and Herminius, who kept the bridge so well in the days of ancient Rome, these 3 bordermen, true representatives of one variety of American heroism, share together the fame of their exploit, as that day they stood together in their small boat in the confusion of the desperate struggle. Samuel Dale at this time was 41 years of age, was about 6 feet and 2 inches in height, and weighed 190 pounds. He possessed a large muscular frame and had no superfluous flesh. James Smith was now 25 years of age, 5 feet and 8 inches in height, very stout and finely proportioned, weighing 165 pounds. Jeremiah Austell was 19 years of age, 6 feet 2 and 1/4 inches in height, very sinewy with no surplus flesh, and weighed 175 pounds. Such physically were the men who proved their superiority, when to them fighting seemed to be a duty, over the Indians of the brave Creek nation. Men who in a hand-to-hand conflict shared the advantages which were needful for ancient heroes and for knights in the Middle Ages of well-trained and hardy muscle. 2 or 3 score of such men springing as boarders upon the deck of a British man-of-war, with or without such a leader as John Paul Jones or Commodore Perry, would soon have cleared the deck and brought the colors down. By means of the captured canoe, the 9 men on the east side now crossed the river. The men all went as far up the river as Cornell's Ferry, and finding no more Indians, returned that night to Fort Madison. Of the 3 men engaged in this conflict, from whose hands one only of the 11 Creek warriors at first seen in the canoe escaped, some further notice may justly be given. Of James Smith but little seems to be known. He was born in Georgia, was a pioneer settler in the river region, is described as a very brave and daring man, and is credited with having contributed very materially to the success of the Canoe engagement. He removed to East Mississippi and there died. Of Samuel Dale, known as Captain Dale and then General Dale, abundant material for a life record exists. He was evidently a remarkable man. A brief abstract of events in his life is all that can here be given. Claiborne, with some flowers of rhetoric, has written his life very fully. He was born in Virginia in 1772. In 1784, his father removed to Georgia and occupied a farm near the Creek Indians. In a few years, his father and mother both died, leaving to him the care of 7 children younger than himself. He became a trader among the Indians, then a guide and mover of families to the river settlements. Before the Creek War, he himself removed to the Alabama River region. After that war, he held office not a little. In 1816, he was a member of the convention to divide the territory. In 1817, he was a member of the Alabama Territorial Assembly. He represented Monroe County, which for some time extended west of the Alabama River to the watershed. In 1824, he was a member of the committee to escort General Lafayette to Alabama's capital. The Alabama legislature conferred on him the rank of brigadier general. In 1830, he was appointed by the Secretary of War, one of the commissioners to remove the Choctaws. In 1831, he removed to Mississippi. In 1836, he represented Lauderdale County. He died at Daleville, Mississippi, in May of 1841. Such were the positions held by the man who suggested and led the canoe fights. He is represented as having declared that in every hour of danger he was cheered by a firm trust in God. Jeremiah Austell, known as Major Austell in all the later years of his life, was also a much more than ordinary man. Born in South Carolina in 1794, spending several years of his youth among the Cherokees, when 18 years of age he came with his father's family into the Mississippi Territory. After the Creek War closed, he became a clerk at St. Stephen's in the store of his uncle, Colonel David Files, then quartermaster of the army. After the death of his uncle in 1820, he became deputy marshal. He removed to Mobile and was appointed clerk of the court of Mobile. He was also appointed city weigher. He represented Mobile in the state legislature. In 1824, he commenced business as commission merchant. In 1837, in that great financial crash, he closed having then 400 customers and finding himself involved in a loss amounting to $170,000. He reasoned in regard to his customers from his knowledge of Indian character, but he found to his loss that in similar circumstances the white man would not deal like an Indian. He admired the Indian business characteristics as he had learned them among the Cherokees. He bought in 1840 the Tombigbee River Plantation, on or near which was located Fort Kearny. He made his home there on the upland among the pines, a mile or two from the river in 1844. His marriage was preceded by circumstances somewhat romantic. This quotation is from Clark and Its Surroundings, page 464. When, on that memorable night in 1813, as bearer of dispatches to General Claiborne, he entered Fort Kearny, the gate was opened by John Eads, and a daughter of his, a young, dark-eyed maiden, she was then 8 years of age, glanced at the tall youth who took his supper with them, and who was so boldly performing a perilous enterprise. This maiden afterwards attended the academy at St. Stephen's, and there as a schoolgirl she met the young clerk, who thought to himself that one day she would surely become his wife. But another maiden came in between them, and through a combination of circumstances to her young Austell was married. Before many years had passed, she died and left no child to represent her. Again, the tall sharer of the honors of the canoe fight met with her whom he had seen in the fort, and who, as a schoolgirl, had stolen his first affections, and before long they were married. A long and happy but changeful life they have spent together. They have 2 sons and 3 daughters. In receiving or forming mental impressions, Major Austell was peculiar. In 1818, he was in New York City for his health, having recovered from an attack of yellow fever in New Orleans, which had reduced his weight from 180 pounds to 96. While in New York, he had a presentiment that his father was dead. He hastened home, making the return trip in 23 days, which was then considered a speedy transit. He found that his father was really dead. Again in 1841, when residing in Cottage Hill near Mobile, at 3 o'clock in the morning a stranger appeared to him in vision or dream, saying, "Dale is dead. He died this morning at 3 o'clock." Several days afterwards, he received a letter from a stranger containing the exact words. After carrying on his plantation for many years, Major Austell died on December 8, 1879, in the 86th year of his age. Possessed of the respect and confidence of all the people, and revered for the long life of usefulness, honor, and patriotism, he had lived on the soil of Alabama. So that's it for this episode. Here we heard about this peculiar battle of hand-to-hand combat in canoes on the Alabama River that gave some amount of fame to the men who were victorious, particularly Samuel Dale and Jeremiah Austell. This fight was framed as 3 versus 9, but to me it seems important to acknowledge the role of Caesar, who had steered the canoe and held the two boats together during the engagement, so it was actually 4 versus 9. The authors also made some claims about white settlers always defeating Indians in hand-to-hand combat. My guess is that there were probably many instances of white settlers losing in hand-to-hand combat that did not get written down either because no one lived to tell the tale, or because American writers were more likely to write about events like the canoe fight where the settlers were victorious. This is episode 5 of 7 in our series on the Creek War, which was a smaller conflict within the War of 1812. In episode 6, we will hear about the Battle of the Holy Ground, where the Americans finally entered into Creek country on the offensive. And then in the last episode, we will hear about the arrival of Andrew Jackson on the scene, and his actions to end the Creek War. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Those channels don't cover much actual history, but we keep this unworthy history alive by reading directly from old books. If you are able and would like to support the mission of Unworthy History, then consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon members will have their chosen name listed at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.